What's up everybody, Noble Comics here to talk about the top 5 most underrated DC Comics characters. Whenever I say underrated, I mean either just in the general public discourse and opinion, they are looked down on undeservedly, or when we're talking about power scaling and how powerful they are underrated that way. But let's get into the top 5 most underrated DC Comics characters. Starting with number 5 is going to be Zatana. Now, Zatana is a character that's been around for quite some time at this point, though I think that she is mostly just treated as a side character, though. Most comic fans probably know her either from the Brian Boland comics from a while ago, or they know him probably from Young Justice if they're a younger viewer. Probably Young Justice is where you know Zatana, and for the first half of that show, she was pretty much treated as, sidekick, side character like everybody else. And I feel like that's how a lot of people view her in the comics, as more of an unserious character. I think she is one of the most impressive DC magical, mystical characters. But in the average comic viewer's mind, I think, when you think of like a magic character from DC, you think of Constantine, you think of Swamp Thing, maybe Dr. Fate. That's who you think of, not really Zatana. She's more of like a side thought. And it could be for a few reasons. I mean, she's quite bland looking. She just looks like a circus magician or something. I think her actual story probably just isn't that interesting compared to people like Swamp Thing, Dr. Fate, Constantine. So that could be it. And maybe because of that, she just doesn't have really a interesting hook to get you attached to the character. And so she ends up being widely forgotten about. When again, she does have some solid comic book appearances. And I'm not saying that she's like an A tier or an S tier character or anything. She's a B tier character, but I feel like most people treat her and see her as like a C or D tier character, not really appreciating that she is a cool character who inhabits this cool niche and is more powerful than you would think. Moving on to number 4, we have Wildcat. Now, I love Wildcat. I'm a huge fan. If this was just like in another list, maybe I would have put him higher, but Wildcat is one of those characters who is wildly underrated. Now, he's one of the best hand-to-hand fighters in all of DC. He's one of the staple members of the Justice Society of America, and the entire JSA is probably underrated to a degree, but I think none more than Wildcat. Like I said, one of the best hand-to-hand fighters. He trained the likes of Black Canary, trained the likes of Batman, Catwoman, and many other of the better hand-to-hand fighters from the DC universe. Specifically boxing, but regardless, his extreme skill is wildly underrated. He also hasn't really had a good solo series in forever, right? I can't think of any. And he probably won't. He doesn't really get much play in DC Comics at all. And again, he probably won't because he's one of those characters that a lot of people just have sort of forgotten about. And there's a lot of those forgotten grandfather type characters in the JSA who are just really not appreciated enough. From the Jay Garrick Flash, Alan Scott Green Lantern, a lot of these older characters who have their mantle passed to younger characters that take the spotlight. Though Wildcat doesn't, he just is overall underappreciated. Moving on to number 3, we have Killer Croc. Now, Killer Croc is one of my favorite Batman villains. He's a fantastic Batman villain. Visually, he's very cool. He's an interesting character just from the actual setup of sort of the man versus monster type of thing. He's also got this niche of a water-based character, but also kind of like a crime lord type of thing. I think they really nailed him in the, 2004, the Batman series? But I do think he's very cool, and he's not just like a lizard clone from Spider-Man, who's also a cool character. But I think that Killer Croc does stand out on his own. But he doesn't really have a lot of good stories. He doesn't really have a lot of good showings in the comics. So, I mean, this is a character that could potentially inhabit the same sort of fan base as like Venom, I think. Not quite with the whole symbiote and everything, but I think of the mannerism and type of character I think Killer Croc falls into, also while also being sophisticated to a degree. But not many people seem to agree. He's pretty much ignored for the most part in the comics. There hasn't really been a good Killer Croc story that I can think of in forever. There haven't been very good power showings or anything for him either. So he's really like this C-tier character who I think deserves better. Moving on to number 2, the second most underrated character in DC Comics has to be Green Lantern Hal Jordan. Now, there's lots of different Green Lanterns, and You could make a case that all of them are underrated to a degree, but of course, Hal Jordan is the most popular. He's the one everyone thinks of when they think of Green Lantern. He's an OG Justice Leaguer and a staple DC character, right? Now, this is a character where Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, has had great comic book runs in the past, right? Like Ethan Van Sciver and Jeff Johns stuff was obviously great. That's kind of where I think the character was at its peak. So there's definitely a fan base for Green Lantern. He's definitely had great runs. He's appeared in lots of animated stuff. He's appeared on screen. So he's not quite as underrated as some of these other characters, but I think in general, a large portion of the comic book community seems to treat him like a side character. I feel like he has one really good comic run and then nothing really after that for a long time until some other creative team comes around that understands the character and appreciates the character also. But for the most part, people seem to think of him as a side character. They think of him as less powerful than he actually is. I mean, he's one of these characters that could potentially rival Superman in terms of power. The ring, the lantern ring, is like the most powerful weapon in the universe. It's all willpower based. He can turn into pure willpower. He can override his ring. His willpower is so strong. And his powers in general are just cool, making constructs and everything like that. I think realistically on paper, Green Lantern is one of the most powerful superheroes that DC has to offer. He's one of the most powerful Justice League members. I think that he's more powerful than, say, Wonder Woman, for example, but he's not ever treated that way. He's rarely ever shown that way outside of, his own comics where maybe some big events happening, like the Black Hand stuff and everything. But I do think in general he does deserve better. Like I said, his comic run of late have not been good. I think he's probably a character that has some ebbs and flows in terms of popularity and everything. And right now we might just be on a down period for him, but I definitely think that he is underrated and underappreciated when he really has so much to offer and should be like one of the main DC characters as far as public opinion and sales and power levels and everything like that, which he just doesn't get. Now, before we get to number 1, let's go over some honorable mentions for most underrated DC character. First, I'll say Shazam. Shazam's a cool character. At one point, he was more popular and sold better than Superman, but it's been a long time since then. He's also had to be reworked from Captain Marvel to Shazam, I assume because of legal stuff with Marvel. That's what makes sense to me. He has an interesting story. He has interesting powers. Physically, he should be roughly equivalent to Superman in terms of power, but he's rarely ever treated as such, and you never see him have any feats like on the level of Superman. And I think he is sort of an underutilized character that does have a lot of potential that's rarely explored. Next is Alan Scott. Now, I know I'm kind of cheating here because I already mentioned the JSA. I already mentioned Green Lantern. But Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern, I think does stand out a little bit more from the rest because he's not a typical Green Lantern. He doesn't have like a power battery and a ring like everybody else, but he has the Star Heart, which is a more powerful, different sort of form of Green Lantern power, I guess. It's magical based. I just think that there's a lot there for his character. I think he's very cool. Obviously, I've talked about the JSA before, and I think that he is just overall underrated. Finally, I've got Swamp Thing here, and he's kind of a toss-up because he has appeared a lot more often in media from, video games and everything like that, and he has been a popular comic character, but I think the average comic fan probably doesn't think much of him, and his power level actually is pretty extreme on the upper ends, right? But he is never really treated as such or talked about as such in many of the comic debates that I've seen. Finally, number 1, the moment we've all been waiting for, the most underrated character in DC Comics. You already know who it is. Who else could it be but Aquaman? Aquaman, number 1 most underrated. He is the most clowned on DC Comics character. He has been for decades. He's been ridiculed for decades in many different forms of media. We've all seen the Family Guy clip making fun of Aquaman. He's like a joke character. And look, DC, bless their heart, they've tried their best to make him cool forever, right? To take him from the Super Friends character to, giving him a hook for a hand and the beard and the long hair and all sorts of different stuff. They got Jason Momoa to play him. They're obviously trying to turn him from this joke character into a cool character. And maybe to a degree, it's starting to work. But he has rarely, if ever, had a solid comic run or solid comic sales. I think it's probably hard to make a compelling and interesting comic around Atlantis. It doesn't really seem like people are interested, and Namor with Marvel has had the same problem forever. So there's a potential that he will just always be a side character and always be a bit of a joke. But he is interesting to a degree, maybe more interesting as a side character. He is quite powerful. He's been able to draw blood from people like Superman before. He's obviously no slouch, even though he is treated as a pretty weak character generally. So I believe that there is potential that he could be reworked and he could be cool, but maybe there is too much holding him back. Maybe he is too much of a meme at this point to ever be cool and actually viewed as just what he is. Because again, power-wise, he is up there. Lore and storytelling-wise, I think is interesting enough. But unfortunately, I think that the memes will forever keep him down as the most underrated character in all of DC Comics. But that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.